This is the first lecture for Music 307, and today we're going to be talking about musical elements. And I'll be playing some listening examples. Hopefully you've already done the reading for this section. That is in your reader, and it is the first reading section. And don't worry about the listening examples. I will be talking about the correct listening examples today. So the reading in your reader goes from page 1 to top of page 13. So those are the things we're going to be covering today. First of all, let's talk about the world of sound. All sound begins with a vibration. And that term vibration is a really important term that we're going to be applying in a little while to musical instruments. So music is part of the world of sound. All sound is made up of vibrations. Those vibrations travel through a medium, usually air, to the human ear and the brain, where we analyze it as bluegrass music or flamenco music, for instance. So let's apply this idea of all sound beginning with a vibration to musical instruments. The musical instrument classification that you're used to from classical music, which is strings, brass, winds, and percussion, doesn't necessarily work well for other kinds of ensembles that you might find around the world. So we have to devise a new system of instrument classification, and we're adopting a system that was devised by Kurt Sachs and Erich von Hornbostel, great German ethnomusicologists back in the 1930s. And so it's called the Hornbostel-Sachs instrument classification. And if you look at their classification, there's really only 4 different ways of classifying instruments. Number 1, chordophones are those instruments that have vibrating strings. So, an example of a chordophone from the West would be a violin. From a non-Western country, the sitar. So chordophones, chordo from the Greek word meaning string, phone meaning sounding. Chordophones, any instrument with vibrating strings. Number 2, aerophones are instruments that have a vibrating column of air. Think of a clarinet. Or, from Australia, the famous instrument that creates a droning sound out of a hollowed-out eucalyptus branch called a didgeridoo. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So, air-sounding instruments, aerophone. Next, instruments that have vibrating membranes, whether they're made out of animal skin or synthetic skin, are called membranophones. Think of all the different kinds of drums you find around the world. Snare drum, taiko drum from Japan. So that encompasses a lot of instruments that we're familiar with. But in the Book of Musical Instruments, that's really only about half of the instruments you find around the world. Believe it or not, most instruments fall into this last category called the idiophone category. Id, from self, think of it as self-vibrating, or instruments where the vibrating medium is the material the instrument's made out of itself. Think gongs, cymbals, shakers, bells. None of those have fixed pitch or can play melodies, but there are idiophones that do play melodies. For instance, xylophones, marimbas, glockenspiels, vibraphones, embiras, kalimbas. Those are all idiophones that play melodies as well. So non-pitched and pitched idiophones. So, in class, we will do an activity that will help you to remember that. But let's go on now and talk more about music. Again, music is an art form based on the organization of sound in time. Let's look at the way that music is organized. There's a number of different ways that we ferret out and talk about the different ways in which music is organized. First of all, timbre. Timbre is the characteristic sound of a voice or instrument. Let's just talk about voices for a little while. There's many different ways to describe the sound of a voice. Some voices can be described as dark, or reedy, or rough, think of blues, or bright, or warm, or raspy. Some voices are more on the nasal side, especially in places like North Africa and the Middle East. Some cultures believe it's best to sort of resonate from the chest. Some cultures sing in a very relaxed tone, others very tense. So let's listen to an example of music from Islam. This is the Islamic call to prayer, very famous example. And the Islamic call to prayer is on your listening CD. It's CD example 1 on CD 2. So CD 2, number 1. And it sounds like this.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
In that example, there's only one voice. There's no harmony. There's not multiple voices. There are no instruments in the background. So we say the texture is monophonic. And the voice itself has sort of a nasally and bright timbre and tense. So again, this would be an example of a nasal, tense, and bright timbre. Contrast that example with CD2 listening example 7 from South Africa. That is a very famous vocal group from South Africa named Ladysmith Black Mambazo. They are on the Paul Simon Graceland album. And their vocal timbre can be described as warm, dark, sort of singing more with sort of a chest-type voice. And contrast that with this very, very famous style of singing from Mongolia and the Russian Republic of Tuva, called Tuvan throat singing. This is CD1, number 12. So even though it might have sounded like there are two different singers there was only one singer singing a drone, a low, constant pitch. At the same time, he was manipulating the sound of that and emphasizing high harmonics that are part of pretty much every sound to get this low drone plus a whistle sound up on top. And that style of singing is called kumi. And it's also known generically as harmonic or overtone singing or throat singing. And we will talk more about that later. That singing is very connected to nature and spirit. So it's believed that you can tap into the spirit of nature through singing like this. And as I said a few seconds ago, it emphasizes harmonics. Those are the very high frequencies that are part of practically every sound. So, let's move on from timbre and talk about pitch. Pitch is the highness or lowness of a sound. I'll use the piano to demonstrate. High pitch, low pitch. And to be able to make music, though, we need to have more than just general high and low. We need to have specific tones. And out of those tones, which have specific frequencies, we make scales. And scales are what are used to construct melodies. You guys have all heard the major scale. But to be able to make music, we need more than single tones. We need sometimes two tones. And whenever two tones are compared, we call the distance between them an interval, the distance between any two tones. And maybe the only thing that might be universal among cultures would be the octave, because when men and women sing together, they're typically singing in an octave. But I have to say that there's probably a lot of cultures that don't even allow or typically have men and women sing together, because in a lot of traditional cultures, men's activities are very separate from women's activities. So even that would be up to controversy, whether you even find the interval of an octave in cultures. Let's go on and talk about melody. And melody, as is the case with a lot of these elements, is something that you've experienced a lot ever since you first started playing music or listening to music. But you may not be able to put into words very easily what the definition of a melody is. As a matter of fact, I don't even like this definition, but I challenge you to come up with a better definition of melody. Melody is the series of tones that add up to a recognizable whole. And as unsatisfying as that definition is, it sort of taps into something that is an important quality of melodies, the recognizability of melodies. So, for instance, there used to be a television show back in the 1970s called Name That Tune. And it challenged contestants to be able to name a tune by only hearing 3, 4, 5 tones. And I'm sure that, I could play a number of different melodies on the piano and only play 3 tones, for instance. And you should be able to identify that's the Star-Spangled Banner or Jingle Bells, or just even 2 tones. Maybe you recognize that as the first 2 notes of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. So again, the recognizability factor is an important aspect of melodies. And melodies move. They have shapes or contours. So a melodic contour can be arched shaped or mostly descending, meaning going down, or mostly ascending, starting low and going up. Or it can be static, not really changing up or down a whole lot. A scale is a series of pitches from high or low or from low to high. It's a building block of music. Western scales are based on 12 equal tones per octave, from which 7 notes are chosen to form a scale, typically. But, a little word of warning, in a lot of cultures, the scales are very different than we are used to. And they use tuning systems that are very different than our equal-tempered scale. So we can talk about that more in class. It's a very controversial issue because our equal-tempered scale, in other words, dividing the octave into 12 equal parts, is a nice way of dividing it. But there's many different ways of dividing an octave. There's nothing perfect about a 12-tone equal-tempered scale. Some of the intervals are actually quite out of tune. Chinese actually toyed with the idea of adopting the scale we use, like about 100 years before it was adopted in Europe, but they decided that the scale we use, the chromatic scale or the 12-note equal-tempered scale, is too out of tune for them. So every way of dividing an octave has its positives and negatives. In the West, we like to modulate to different keys. In other cultures, they like their scales to be more pure. And that pure scale is called the just scale. That's the one that's based on completely harmonic, completely pure ratios of or divisions of the octave. So, for instance, in India, you might hear a whole concert that's all in one key, and basically they use a low drone, and the focus is not so much on harmony, but on melodic development and these beautiful intervals that just melt in your ears. So, we will talk more about that in class when we get to specific cultures. Let's go on to the world of rhythm. Rhythm is the pattern of notes and silences in music. So answer me this question. I'm going to do something. You tell me if it has rhythm. Maybe some of you will say that had rhythm, that didn't have rhythm. Really, everything that happens has rhythm. So, of course, that had rhythm. It had a pattern of notes, had silences. It wasn't a regular pattern, but it was a pattern nonetheless. There's a lot of music that has no regular pattern, and a lot of music that does. When it does have a regular pattern, we call that music that has a beat or a pulse. A beat is a regular recurring pulsation that divides music into equal units of time. Furthermore, 99.9% of the time, those beats are organized into regular groups, and that is called meter. Most common way of organizing beats is into groups of 2, duple meter, and groups of 3, triple meter. So, groups of 2 would be multiples of 2, 2, 4, 8, 16. Triple, groups of 3s could be 3, 6, 12, 24. Actually, triple meter could be 9 as well, 3 groups of 3. Some cultures, especially Eastern European and Middle Eastern, don't really stick to regular meters. And their meters are really a combination of 2s and 3s. For instance, there are a lot of songs in Greece that have this meter of 2 plus 2 plus 3, and you would clap it like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So, in a lot of cultures, their concept of meter is a lot more complex than ours is in the West. So let's listen to an example of music. This piece is from Mexico. You probably recognize this music. It's mariachi music. And this example is called La Negra. It's probably the most famous example of mariachi music. If you go to a restaurant that plays mariachi music, this is probably going to be the first song they open with. And note the meter underlying counting is in triple meter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that example would be described as being triple meter. If you wanted to put it in more Western terms, we call that 6/8 sometimes because you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here's another example of music. This one is from the country of Zaire. And Zaire, or the Congo, is in Central Africa. And in this part of Africa, they have fantastic pop music. Sounds like this. You can count this in 4s, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, or even faster. Like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This example comes in 2 different parts. The first part based on Cuban rhythms, the second part based on African rhythms. So let me fast forward it so you can hear that transition. Coming up. Both in duple meter. That's CD2 number 12, I believe. CD2 example number 12. Let's move on. We've talked about music in triple meter and duple meter. Let's listen to an example that is what we call an additive meter. And this is by the great Ivo Papazov, one of the greatest clarinet players in the world. And listen to this example. It is on CD number 3, I believe. And it is actually CD number 3, number 2. CD3, number 2. And after an introduction that is in no meter, it's just free rhythm, it goes into a section that is in the meter of 2 plus 2 plus 3, or 7. And I'll be clapping those main beats. I'll be clapping every main beat because it's too fast to clap in 7. Here's the beginning of it. Let's fast forward. So while that piece is playing, try to clap along in about this tempo. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. It's pretty fast. And it's challenging to be able to do it. So give it a try when you have a chance. Next example does not come from Albania. So we're going to just scratch that one. And let's move on to tempo. Tempo is the speed of music. You already know that. In this class, we'll just talk about it as fast, slow, medium fast, medium slow. We don't have to use terms from Italian in here. Let's just use generic terms. One of the aspects of music and one of the elements that you probably talked about before and discussed in your music history class is texture. And there's a lot more variety of textures when we're listening to music from around the world. So we're going to really focus a little bit on this and spend some time on it. Texture is the layers of sound. Mostly we're focusing on rhythm and melody when we're talking about texture in music and how those layers interrelate. The simplest texture is monophony. Monophony is where there's just one melody and one melody only. Remember earlier we listened to the call to prayer, the Islamic call to prayer, CD2, number 1. That's a great example of monophony. Just one melody and nothing else. So that's pretty simple. Monophonic, one sound. Polyphonic, on the other hand, is many sounds. 2 or more melodies, and each of those melodies must be equally important and independent from one another. And we do find some polyphony in world music. There are a lot of cultures that have very, very thick textures. I think of the Babanzali are the Mbuti people, the people that used to be called the Pygmies. That is a pejorative term, so we don't use that anymore. Central African rainforest people. And their melodies are extremely complex, where there's layers and layers of melodies that interweave. I don't have an example of that music, but check it out on YouTube if you're interested in hearing that. And there's many other cultures that really do use true polyphony. But there's not going to be a whole lot in this course. What is more common, of course, is homophony, which is the most common texture in Western music. That's one melody with chords, 3 or more. A chord is 3 or more notes sounded at once. I don't know if I need to spend more time on that. That is the texture you pretty much are the most familiar with. And 90-some% of the time that we listen to music in the West, we're hearing homophony, one melody with chords. But it is not the most common texture in the world. Actually, the most common texture is a texture we don't experience that much. It's called heterophony. Heterophony is one basic melody performed by 2 or more instruments or voices, each with their own unique ornamentation and rhythm. Think Asian traditional music. In China, Korea, Japan, India, the Middle East, Indonesia, throughout all those cultures, the most common way of making music is everyone's performing their own version of the melody, with certain rules, of course. It's just not a free-for-all. So, an example of heterophony would be the silk and bamboo music that you find in China. And this example would be example 15 on CD1. This is what heterophony sounds like. Again, the silk and bamboo music from China, example 15 on CD1. This is music for the musician's personal enjoyment. They usually perform it in a club. They're usually facing one another rather than facing out to an audience. And it actually reminds me a lot of bluegrass music, because it's the same kind of thing with old-time and bluegrass music, where people get together and jam just as much for their own performance as that of an audience. But the sound of all the instruments, wind and stringed instruments, everyone's playing their own version of a melody. That is heterophony. Last but not least, one other texture. Instead of many melodies, with polyrhythmic music, we're talking about many layers of rhythm. And the most common example, or the example that probably comes to your mind, is African traditional music, like West African drumming that you're probably familiar with. Okay, so those are 5 different textures. Again, monophony, polyphony, homophony, heterophony, and polyrhythmic texture. Let's go on to form. Form is the organization of musical ideas in time. One of the most common forms we find in Western music is ABA form. You start off with an idea, a different melody in the middle, come back to the original melody or the original idea, end of story, ABA. There are names for some of the most common forms. ABA form is also known as ternary or 3-part form. AAA ... is also known as strophic form. You find that form with storytelling, ballads, which are songs that tell a story. And that's pretty common. You also find very commonly binary form, which is where you have 2 melodies that are alternating back and forth, usually with repetition of each melody once. So AA, then BB, then AA, baby, dot, dot, dot. That can go for a long time. And typically people, you might have heard that kind of form in dance music, like Irish dance music, or old-time dance music. A lot of other cultures use that form. Think music from Canada, Cape Breton dance music, and that example is on CD 3, and it is example 20. Let's listen to a little bit of that. CD 3, number 20, you will hear an 8-bar melody, and then you'll hear that 8 bars repeated again, and then you'll hear a different melody played for 8 bars, then repeated again, then back to the beginning. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. B melody. 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Repeat. Back to A. So that is binary form. Binary form. Some music has no repetition. Very little or no repetition. When there's no repetition, we call that form through composed. A, B, C, dot, dot, dot. And you find that in a lot of cultures where the music tells a story, a non-repeating story, instrumentally, without any words. So very similar to a story like Peter and the Wolf. As the story develops, you have very little repetition of the previous idea. You might have motifs that come back, but really in true through composed music, there's very little repetition or no repetition. All these things put together is what we call style. That's the use of musical elements, all these things, melody, rhythm, harmony, which we didn't talk about a whole lot today, but we will at other times. And that is known as style, the use of musical elements that define a place and time and a people. So that is our lecture on musical elements. And thank you for being patient with me. This is actually the first video I've ever made of a lecture. So I hope as the semester goes on, I'll get a little bit more sophisticated in terms of my use of technology and being able to convey music through this medium, which is new to me. So again, thank you for your patience, and I'll see you in class.